This is Lieutenant Titus, a character you may recognise from the Space Marine and upcoming Space Marine 2 game. Specifically, it's WETA Workshops 1/6 scale statue depicting the iconic Ultramarine character. As you can see, even at a sixth of his size, this Titus is still huge and packed full of hand-painted, in-depth details. But is it possible to recreate this incredible statue in the usual Warhammer scale? Well, that's exactly what WETA Workshop have tasked me with, so join me as I build a 28mm scale version of a 1/6 scale Lieutenant Titus statue. But first, let's hear from the sponsors of this video. Are you ready to conquer the battlefields of the far future? Well, look no further than Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, the turn-based strategy mobile game set in the 41st millennium. Take control of over 70 champions from 16 playable factions who are fantastic recreations of Warhammer miniatures, bringing your favourite characters to life. Commissar Yarrick is one of my personal picks, which if you remember my Yarrick kitbash, you'll know why. In Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, you can see him and many other iconic characters come to life in in-depth tactical gameplay that rewards players for clever placement and use of abilities. Whether you're into quick battles on the go, intense PvP duels, or massive collaborative boss fights under your guild banner, Tacticus has it all. It's really easy to drop into, and I often find myself playing a quick game while I'm working on my miniatures, especially in those moments waiting for some glue or a layer of paint to dry. Join a passionate community of Warhammer fans and gamers where your feedback shapes the game's future. With an impressive 4.7 average rating on the app stores, Tacticus is the go-to game for mobile tactical gaming. Check out the game for yourself by using my QR code on screen now or via my link below, and use my code PTW0724 for some in-game bonuses. You can also pick up some extra Blackstone by using my friend referral code U-61-NAP as well. Now, I began this whole process by cheating. That is, rather than trying to sculpt all of those specific Titus details, I instead managed to get my hands on a Lieutenant Titus miniature from the Space Marine board game. Annoyingly, this isn't available in the UK, and I had to go to a Target in New Hampshire to pick one up. I should point out that I was there anyway. Not even my obsession with kitbashing would lead me to making a 7,000-mile round trip for a few bits. Well, not yet anyway. Now, the problem with this particular miniature is that the pose is completely wrong, both from an objective stance for what I needed and, some have said, a subjective one. His slipping on a banana peel pose is a little odd. It would require considerable reposing, but it did give me all of those key details like the Ultramarine emblazoned chest emblem, power pack and knee pad, along with a few other key items such as the head and shoulder pads. My first task was to recreate Titus's pose. This required me to mix and match a few other Primaris legs with the Titus miniature. I selected Assault Intercessor 1A's left leg and used my sword to get a hold of the upper leg from the Assault Intercessor and the lower leg from the Titus miniature. Once the two parts had been removed, they were cleaned up, compared and adjusted until they matched up to create a raised left leg. However, I didn't glue anything just yet. By using the upper right leg from the Intercessor kit, it would no longer fit against Titus's pelvis, so I had to borrow one from the torso of that 1A Assault Intercessor once again. After cutting right below the belt using my saw and cleaning up, I glued it to the upper left leg. As I would be using a new pelvis, I was free to remove the existing one from both halves of Titus's torso. I paid close attention during this process to avoid damaging either piece of the loincloth. My approach here was to make frequent comparisons and small adjustments until both halves of the torso and the new pelvis could fit together properly. But before I brought out the glue, I first removed the right arm from the Titus torso. The position of it was wrong, so it would be replaced later on. But for now, I just focus on removing it and cleaning up the cut afterwards. With this done, the torso, pelvis and left leg could all be glued together. These first few tedious steps had given me a good starting point to build up the rest of the pose around, so when it came to the right leg, things were a little easier. This time I used Titus's original right leg. After removing the tactical rock from the base, it was compared against the rest of the model. In a common theme for this build, I then proceeded to compare and adjust until it was just able to glue the right leg to the rest of the body. However, the left plate needed to be sourced from our friend, the 1A Assault Intercessor. The original came with a holster which our big Titus statue didn't have. After clipping and cleaning up, the new plate was glued to the left hip. The great thing about the big Titus statue is the fact that I was able to easily remove parts for reference. This proved particularly useful for the arms. Starting with the left arm, I took this piece from the regular Primaris Intercessor kit. The angle of the elbow was a little different, but after trimming down the shoulder, it did create a closer approximation to the full-size statue. The right arm proved trickier though. Both the chains wrapped around the forearm and the right-handed chainsword reduced my options here, not to mention the adjustment of the angle. So, to tackle this, my first job was to cut away the small Inquisition symbol, keeping it safe for the time being, before I removed the pistol. This wasn't a straightforward cut though, as I needed to maintain the plate at the back of the hand. The reason for this was because I had to attach a Black Templar Sword Brethren chainsword to it, and the back plate of the hand was missing. I had to settle on this particular component, as it was surprisingly hard to source a right hand holding a chainsword. To better match the big Titus arm, the upper right would be replaced with one from the Assault Intercessor kit. After clipping away the lower part from just below the elbow guard, I then removed the rod from Titus' forearm before adjusting both. Once things were lining up properly, I fully assembled the arm. One of the final details to recreate from the Titus statue was the pistol mag-locked to his hip plate. Once again, sourcing this exact pistol proved to be harder than you'd initially think. I started out with this particular piece from the Intercessor kit. Both the pistol and the grip present on these were ideal for what I needed, so both were removed with my clippers and scalpel before they were glued together to create a full pistol. The next step wasn't entirely necessary, but it did make my painting later on much easier. Rather than gluing the pistol straight to the plate, I instead used a pin. To do this, I started out by drilling a 1mm hole into the plate before supergluing into it a small piece of 1mm wire. The rest of the Titus was much more straightforward though, and simply involved trimming down the inside of the shoulder pads so they could sit across the new arms and then removing the tab from the head. But Titus wasn't the only model that featured on the statue. I next needed to recreate the dead Tyranid at his feet. So I cracked open a box of Hormagaunts and clipped away the parts for a Hormagaunt number 10. But before I was able to do anything with the gaunt, I first had to build up the concrete slabs of the base. For this, I used my go-to basing material, torn up chunks of cork floor tiles. The main sloping rock was created by gluing down one lump before gluing a larger, narrow piece on top of it. To create that dead look, I then began to adjust the positioning of the Hormagaunt's legs. Starting with the right set of legs, I clipped each joint and trimmed them down in order to adjust the angles. They were then glued back together, leaving me with a better positioned leg. From here, the legs were glued to the torso, and the torso to the rock. Now, to recreate the curb stomp Tyranid look, my first step was to remove the lower jaw from one of the Hormagaunt heads, before also attaching it to the torso. While the joint wasn't completely perfect, it didn't matter too much as Titus' foot would be covering it once the model was complete. To attach the left scythe, I clipped away the tab that allowed me to reposition the arm. The left set of rear legs were then split, trimmed and glued. Finally, the right claw was clipped down, its tab was removed, and the arm was also glued to the Hormagaunt's torso. I continued to build up the rocks around the base before I realized that the middle claw on the left side needed to be removed and glued separately to the base. More rocks were added, the clipped away blade was attached along with plenty of citadel skulls. All that was left to do now was to fill in all those gaps with some texture paste. But before I began any painting, I repeated the same pinning technique that I'd used on the bolt pistol across all of those separate pieces. By keeping the parts separate from the main model, it made my life much easier when painting them. Speaking of which, I began the painting by giving everything a coat of black primer. I chose black to help with those darker recesses of the armor and around the base. I chose an airbrush primer for this, but any black primer would have worked just as well. After priming, my first area to tackle was the armor, and in order to recreate that iconic ultramarine blue, I started by giving the armor a layer of marine blue from the Tooth and Coats range. This was applied via my airbrush, but this was only to speed up application, and applying the paint via a regular brush would have been fine too. To create some shading in the blue armor, I laid out some marine blue and Doom Death Black onto my wet palette and mixed in a little water into each one in order to thin it out. A thin layer of this marine blue was then applied across a single panel of armor, and while the paint was still wet, I then painted a small amount of the thinned Doom Death black towards the bottom of it before dragging the brush into the still wet blue. This helped to blend the two together in a gradient. The effect not only recreated that scene on the larger Titus, but it also left me with a less flat looking and slightly more weathered looking armor. After creating the gradients across all of the armor, I then proceeded to add highlights. The first of these consisted of a mixture of marine blue and Elysium Blue to create a shade between the two. This highlight was applied across every one of the edges of the armor. These thin lines of paint helped to differentiate them from the darker recesses and gave depth to the armor. The first highlight was followed by a second using some pure Elysium Blue this time around. While the previous highlight was applied across all edges, this lighter line was instead focused to only the upper edges of each panel. While there are many sculpted details already present on Titus, his left shoulder pad was missing an ultramarine icon, which meant that I had to apply a decal. I first prepped the shoulder pad with a coat of gloss varnish. This provided a smoother surface that not only protected the paint beneath, but also allowed the transfer to sit closer to the surface, reducing that ghosting effect. From here, I cut out the transfer and soaked it in some water until it was lifting from its backing paper. This was then carefully teased away from the paper and into place with a damp brush. After giving it a little time to dry, I then coated the transfer with some microsol. This is a mild solvent that softens out the decal, allowing it to better sit across the surface. I usually apply a couple of coats, letting them dry fully between applications. Finally, to fix the transfer in place and to dull down that earlier gloss varnish, I gave the decal a coat of matte varnish, which left me with a more painted on look. The Titus statue features extensive weathering and battle damage, and while this mini Titus did have some sculpted on damage, it could be pushed further. This was achieved by applying some fine lines of my earlier Doom Death Black, followed by a line of Elysium Blue running parallel directly beneath it. By combining these two colours, it created the effect of indentations and scratches in the armour, even though the surface was smooth. This effect was repeated across the model, and even over the decal that I applied in the previous step. The highlights were then continued with only the most prominent edges of the blue armour being aligned with a small amount of Celestial Blue. Before I finished the armour with a few small spots of Celestial Blue mixed with White Star. This even lighter blue was used as an extreme highlight, which saw me applying it to just the corners of the sharper edges across the armour. With the armour completed, I was able to move on to the metallics. Now, during this whole process, I was very careful not to overspill into the blue parts of the armour, as metallics can be quite difficult to paint over. I began with the silver metallics and started out with a base coat of Dwarven Iron. To help darken down those recesses, I then took some Black Legion contrast paint and thinned it out with a little airbrush thinner. This resulted in a less viscous mixture, which, when applied across the metallics, caused them to pool into the recesses. When it darkened, it left me with the appearance of shadows. These shadows were then built upon with an edge highlight of Surcoat Silver, followed up by an extreme highlight of Mythril Blade. This process was then repeated over the golden details. For these, I started out with a base coat of Spartan Bronze, washed it with some thinned Cygor Brown, before I began the highlights, starting with Dragon's Gold, and then finally, some Glistening Gold. With the metallics complete, I changed out my paint water and began to tackle all of those areas between the armor panels as well as the weapon stocks and pouches. These were, for the most part, already black, but some Doom Death Black was applied over them as a base coat. These black details were then split into two groups, with me focusing on the non-pouches first. For these, I started out with an initial highlight mixture of Death Reaper and Dungeonstone Grey, followed by a finer highlight of Dungeonstone Grey. I also used this to create some scuffs and scratches in a similar way to how I tackled the armor earlier. These were then finished off with some small spots of Carcharadon Grey. I then turned my attention to the pouches. These were first highlighted with Ashen Grey, then Eidolon Grey, including some scuff marks, and finally some small spots of Rodent Grey. With the black details complete, I could turn my attention to the white details. These included the knee pad and the loincloth, and for both of these I started out with a base coat of Wizard Grey, before layering on some thinned Carcharadon Grey. This was done in a similar manner to the black shading across the blue. Layering up several thin layers of the grey left me with a smoother transition. Finally, these areas were highlighted with some white star. For the various pieces of parchment, the bones in Titus's reliquary and the skull on the shoulder pad, I began with a base coat of Dragon Fang. These details were then washed with Archaic Sepia to help darken down their recesses, followed by some edge highlights of Skeleton Legion. Finally, I added a few small dots of Ivory Tusk as an extreme highlight. Next, I focused on the red details, such as the wax of the Purity Seals along with the halo of the shoulder pad. These were first base coated with Berserker Red, highlighted with Sanguine Scarlet, and finally, Demon Red. For Titus's face, I began with a base coat of Barbarian Brawn. Now, during this entire process of tackling the face, I approached things very steadily. By using a thinned mixture and slowly building the layers up one by one, I was left with softer transitions. As I progressed through to the lighter Dwarven Skin, I continued this slow application. By the time I came to apply the highlight of Elven Skin, I was left with a much more realistic looking skin tone. Titus's hair was much more straightforward though, and I began with some Scorched Earth, highlighted it with Ancient Forest, and followed up with a few small spots of Wasteland Brown. This completed the main part of the Titus and allowed me to turn my attention to his base. To help speed up the base coat across the base, I started out by airbrushing some Wizard Grey across the rocks, before coating the entirety of the dead Tyranid with a few steadily built up layers of Ivory Tusk. Both of these areas were then tidied up by applying the same paint, but with a regular brush. To paint those High Fleet Leviathan colours of the Hormigaunt, I started out with a base coat of Dread Red that was applied across the claws, hooves and gaps between the chitin. These details were then washed with Hellion Red, followed by a first highlight of Asmodeus Red, and finally a few small spots of Sanguine Scarlet. I then turned my attention to the armour plates. These were started out with a base coat of Royal Cloak. The recesses were then directly targeted with a wash of Black Legion, before I began work on the highlights, first with Sorcerer's Cloak, followed by some Runic Purple. To create that pinkish hued white for the rest of the Tyranid's chitin, I created an extremely thin wash of Volupus Pink contrast paint with some airbrush thinner, similarly to my earlier metallic washes. This was then applied across all the remaining areas of the Hormigaunt, which created a light pinkish hue. These areas were then followed by an edge highlight of Ivory Tusk, and then Trooper White. From here, I then repeated the same steps that I'd followed for the earlier parchment and bones across the skulls on the base, and the edges of the rocks were highlighted with some Carcharadon Grey. All that was left to do now was to apply those final finishing touches to the model. This started out with a coat of matte varnish applied via my airbrush. This helped to protect the paintwork and helped to remove any unnecessary glossiness created by the washes. Following this, I was able to finally assemble the model. After removing the wire holders, I cleaned up the contact points before gluing them together. This step is important as gluing paint to paint is nowhere near as strong as plastic to plastic. With everything assembled, the final step was to add that gore that is present on the big Titus statue. This blood was created by mixing a tiny drop of Black Legion in some Blood Angel's Red contrast paint to create more of a realistic blood colour. In addition to this, I also mixed in some gloss varnish to give me that shiny effect. This was then applied across the Hormigaunt, Titus's boots, and the chainsword, and with that, I was left with this. And here we have the completed Warhammer-scaled Lieutenant Titus statue. Now, while there are a few slight differences in the pose, the Purity Seals are in different places, and the Hormigaunt's tail isn't wrapped around his leg, I think, for the most part at least, I've been able to capture a pretty close approximation to the Lieutenant Titus statue. This whole process has been quite different for me too. Instead of corrupting a Primarch, building a custom tank, or even just making up a new chapter, this build has been simply recreating, as close as possible, the posing and details of what is essentially just another Warhammer miniature, albeit a lot bigger. Now before I go, I just want to say a huge thank you to WETA for putting me up to this task and sending me their extremely impressive Titus statue. I'll include some links below where you can check out WETA Workshops' full range of statues and prop replicas. You can also find the full list of kits and paints that I used to build this miniature in the description below, along with some affiliate links which help to support the channel. Speaking of supporting my channel, let me say a huge thank you to everyone who already helps me out. In particular, my Pouch of Dead and Elbits tier and above supporters who are Andrew Console, Axel Jonsson, Berserker, Bits of Wargaming, Chris Reynolds, Daniel Dowling, Gabe Benavides, Hugh Wright, Ilniro Gileri, Immaterial Creations, Maciej Savitsky, Molly Mork, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Nathan, Nima, Pale Juice, Ryan Little, Splinkus, Swedsman, Tim, Tom Haysmith, and War Novice. And my Sergeant level channel members who are Under Z, Kutch Kato, Roll 1 to Explode, Set Thacit Aponsawat, The Sire Acquired, Lloyd Davies, Phoenix's Den, Trooper Geo, Mr. Jared Hess 95, David, John Gibbs, Philip Bowyer, Learning to Paint, Mark Taylor, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.